now you're listening to the Mannin line. This is part of our Sunday proceedings, which you should be taking part in, and you do that by either telephoning us, texting us, or sending us an email. Now, the telephone number is 66 13 68, as always. If you're off island, which some of our listeners are, then the code number's 01624. You can text us to 166177, that's 166177, and the code is 07624, or you can email us to studio@manxradio.com. I'm Roger Watterson, and on our switchboard is Catherine Nichol, and she's now waiting your calls. And with me in the studio is Neal Mellon, who is director of the Isle of Man Foodbank, which was the topic of our conversation in Sunday Opinion, and Geraldine Martin from the Isle of Man Probation Service, who is working pretty closely with Neal Mellon to try and provide some services and to do a whole variety of things, as you heard if you heard the first programme. We'll come back on to that a little later, but very shortly, in fact. So 66 13 68, please. That's the number to call. Now, as we're talking about Foodbank and meals in one way or another, or food for meals, of course, there's still quite a lot of argument going on about the Meals for Wheels. That Age Concern is now saying that they're a bit worried about the possibility of, instead of delivering the food in the way that it needs to be treated, it's going to arrive as frozen food, and there are people perhaps who might have difficulties with that. So that's still an ongoing argument or a debate there. What has cropped up in the news, and it sort of pops out, but it pops out every year, but apparently quite aggressively this year, and that there are Christmas net scans, people who are doing all sorts with your credit cards, or trying to do with your debit card, or dealing with companies who turn out to be bogus or fraudulent, but they take your details. So all of that. There is issues about to come forward at Tynwald to be debated. One of them is the new resident database, which is now the Council of Ministers is rather keen to crack on with it. We'll be probably discussing that in a programme as we go into the new year and having a look at some of the issues and the safeguards of it. But if you've got any ideas about it at the moment, at this early stage, then let us know, please. The Chief Constable says he was wary about relaxing work permits because we could get what he termed the wrong sort of people in the Isle of Man if we're not careful. And also the United Kingdom has now Theresa May has now got a first deal. It's the first of many, I think, with regard to the UK coming out of the European Union. And of course, the Isle of Man will be following into slipstream. And at a glance, it's the deal so far: citizens' rights, criminal record checks for EU nationals applying to settle here, only a minor role for EU judges, which ends in 8 years' time. Child benefit and EU health insurance card rules to continue, which of course doesn't affect us. Britain's divorce bill will total between 35 and 39 million, which again doesn't affect us that much. And a 2-year transition deal when the UK will shadow EU rules. That probably will, and there might be a cost attached to it. Existing spending commitments, well, that again doesn't affect us, but it could cost another 20 million. The European Investment Bank will pay the UK back quite a bit of money over the time. And one thing that might have a significant effect on us, especially with the common travel area, no hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. That's in the first of the deal that's just been announced in the last 24 hours. Any comments, please? Well, there we are, 66 13 68. And we were talking about charities and all sorts of things earlier on. And there was something that came to my mind was the Douglas Coal Fund. And I think that is still going, but I don't know whether or not actually it has much in the way of... do you know whether it's still... It is, isn't it?
The Coal Fund is still functioning, and I believe they sit now just for 2 months of the year, December and January.
Yes. But it can't be the same need for coal. I presume they contribute some other way, do
they? Contribute in alternative ways. You're quite right, Roger. The... Douglas Coal Fund, I believe, is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, charity on the Isle of Man. It should be supported. It deserves to be supported. What they do now is they'll work with individuals in need and either help with fuel bills, or if there's a need to repair, replace boiler, money can be put towards that.
Right, now, looking at the Foodbank websites for the UK, they say that they've been preparing for a while and now in the middle of a very difficult winter and consider themselves part of Britain's social safety net. Would you say this winter's been difficult for you up to now?
No, I don't think it's been any more so than any other year.
No. Yeah, you're not quite the same pressures as perhaps they have over there just at the moment, is there? But nevertheless, as we said earlier on, they are here, aren't they?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is again down to how we work. The fact that we work in a manner to help people back to being independent. We don't want people to develop a dependency on the charity. So most people are very short term, and then they're back to being independent. They can always return at some time in the future if they need to. We don't see too many people come back as repeat guests.
I'm never absolutely certain, Geraldine, because I've heard so many different definitions of this. What's the purpose of a probation service and a probation order? What does that do for the person who's been convicted? Or society, for that matter?
Well, what it does for society is protect the public. So I joined the service many years ago now, and in those days it was about advising, assisting and befriending offenders. And probation historically came from the missionaries that were in the courts in the late 1800s. So that's where we started from, but we changed quite dramatically, and now we would be talking about protecting the public by allowing offenders to reform their lives. So it's about believing that people can change and supporting them to change. So that's what we do for the offender, and as I said, for the public it's very much about trying to protect them. So for example, when Neal popped into the office the other day, he quickly realised I wasn't going to be able to talk to him because I was in the middle of recalling an offender to prison, which has to have my signature on it, or one of my deputies, or the governing governor. And so when that happens, we have to take a very quick decision that something has happened that is not going to benefit the public by having that individual at large in the community. And so that is the worst case scenario of a day in probation. A good day is when somebody comes in and tells you that they've been offence free for a number of months or years, that they're settled, that something you said to them actually resonated at some point. All of those things are the better days.
Now, I can recall more than one Chief Constable saying on this programme very often that somewhere amongst all the crimes that are on the schedule of crimes that have been committed, alcohol is a significant part, plays a significant part in it. Not drugs, alcohol. Do you find that when you in the people you're having to deal with?
Certainly alcohol's a factor in that, but much more so in terms of drugs. If the governing governor was here today, he would tell you that when offenders are admitted to prison, they are drug tested, and 75% of those offenders test positive. Another 10% refuse. So in his words, that's 85% of offenders have a problem with substances of some kind or another, and that can be combined with alcohol, or alcohol can be a factor of its own.
Right, now, first of the questions come in here now, Neal, by Texas. Query for the Foodbank guys. Upon gearing up to an appointment with the Foodbank crew, what should you present to the charity, and is it required to have a phone number? I think he means is he required to have one. And then he comments, frank it is, he says, I guess youth is wasted when you're old. Now, I think what he really means is that, first of all, what if you come to the food bank, what do you have to tell them? How should you go about it?
Right. When clients come to the food bank, but what they'll do actually is they'll come in, be referred into Housing Matters Isle of Man on Albany Lane in Douglas, and they'll be taken through an interview process. So obviously all the domestic identifiers will be required: name, address, contact numbers. We'll need that so that we can arrange appointments, etc. And then there'll be a detailed interview to identify the key factors that push somebody over the edge and into a situation of need. The team there will develop an action plan for the client to complete. They own that action plan. It's for them to do, not for us. and in the interim then they'll be provided with food on a weekly basis.
Right, so they do have to go through a vetting procedure, effectively.
Absolutely. That's repeated at 4 weeks. I'd be advised of any clients that have reached that stage, and will make a decision whether they can remain on it for longer. And if anyone hits 12 weeks, then there's a very formal review process that I tend to lead.
Is there any likelihood of people becoming dependent on it?
We always endeavour not to encourage people to become dependent. That was one of the aims we had from our outset, not becoming what's called toxic charity. Mm-hmm. We do have a small number of clients who have been supported for a longer period, but that's because we identify that in spite of doing everything that's on their action plan, in spite of trying to make as many changes as possible, they're still struggling.
Does government contribute in any way directly to you, apart from the efforts and assistance of various people? Do you actually get any cash?
There's no cash, and never has been. Government has helped us by providing very low rent accommodation for our storerooms, and we appreciate that. But at this time of year we tend to run out of space, and we rely on other organisations such as schools and commissioners to allow us to have some food temporarily in their premises.
Right. Now, good afternoon, says Anne. Do the directors, and those I think who she was referring to as well as working on the food bank, take a salary for this, or do they give up their time for free?
All the directors are volunteers, so there's no salaries paid to directors. We do make a donation to Housing Matters for the work that they undertake for us in interviewing our clients.
All right. Okay, now let me just remind you before we go on that this is the Mannin line, which means you can take part in the programme, and the telephone number is 66 13 68 if you're listening at home. There's been a number of subjects in the Talking Heads programme this week as well which attracted your attention. Airport security delays and a security upgrade came pretty well top of the list. The European Union putting the Isle of Man on a grey list, not on its blacklist for tax havens, but a grey list, which means still has to be something done as we go along. Topic IRN, this is the United Kingdom's one, but it's interesting it should crop up this week, bearing in mind what we're talking about, but poverty is on the up in the United Kingdom. Online dangers for teens, that's another topic that was popular on Talking Heads this week. And of course the new meat plant and the new board there. Well, those are Talking Heads topics, but there may be anything else that you might like to talk about. We'd be very pleased to hear from you. 66 13 68 is the number. Now, you might like this one, Neal. Robin Peel says that he would like to thank you all for the amazing work that you do with the most vulnerable in our society.
Oh, thank you very much, Rob.
Right, so that's quite a nice comment. David says, isn't there a difference between relative and absolute poverty? In my day, most people didn't have white goods, telephones, TVs, let alone colour TVs, computers, social media. So most people, he reckons, really aren't that badly off. So, in other words, there's a difference, I suppose, between what we now consider an essential and what in previous times food and clothing were probably, and being warm were the main essentials.
Yes, I think they are still the main essentials. Keeping warm, keeping dry, and being fed. And yes, we can go back through history and look at variations, but what we deal with is what we're presented with at the minute. Mm-hmm. So we're dealing with, if you like, contemporaneous poverty.
But some of the people who come to you because they have a problem, as we've discussed already, I mean, are they all? Do they have all these? Would you know? Do they have all these type of more luxury goods?
There's very few people who don't have TVs. Mm-hmm. There are very few people who don't have perhaps some form of transport or access to some form of transport. But then we have to ask the question, well, what difference does that make? If somebody's coping and suddenly goes into a crisis situation, then it's a sudden and temporary thing. Should we ask people to sell their TV, sell their car, get some cash in and then struggle to get back to that position, or do we help them on that temporary basis? And as I said, 90% of our clients only require 4 to 6 parcels before they've resolved the problem that's pushed them over the edge.
It's interesting that I was looking at a food bank in Cheshire just to make some comparisons, who actually said that it's an affluent area of West Cheshire and 1 in every 100 used a food bank. And this is the better part of Cheshire too.
Yeah, absolutely, because you've got that millionaire triangle in that area. Cheshire, Knutsford, etc.
Health consequences of relying on emergency food seems to be fairly serious in this particular instance. A new UK analysis finds a clear increase in food bank usage as well. It's grown to about 14% in 3 years, but there does seem to be a concern about the people getting sort of caught on the type of food that they get at this. Now, you're hoping to expand it by the sound of it.
Yes, absolutely. About 3 years ago, the British Broadsheets carried some information on research programmes into the use of food banks and asked the question, were food banks bad for your health? And they addressed issues such as vitamin deficiency for long-term use. We haven't got that problem here because A, we don't have that long-term usage for most of the people, and that was also what triggered me to get the allotment out of bread. In retrospect, I'd have been a lot more clever if I went for something like Johnny Watterson's Lane. At the time I was thinking, if we can get the allotment, grow some fresh stuff, get it into the diet and encourage other food providers to give us fresh food, that would help. But it's out of the way, it's not on a main bus route, it's not convenient for people to get to.
Well, Geraldine, a lot of these questions are coming out at the moment for Neal. So here's another one for him. And she says, David says, do you find that some people who benefit from the food bank are willing to help at the food bank subsequently?
Yes, some of our strongest supporters are people who have benefited from the food bank in the past. And they later on will come back and help us in various ways, either volunteering hours or becoming distributors. We haven't touched on it, but at the weekend, the food that comes in from the supermarkets, from Tesco and the like, there are no official outlets open for that food to be issued through. So I tend to run a community service with that. The food goes out to 3 outlets in the Douglas area. I've got one in Pulrose, one up near Old Nobles, and a third, and we take it to houses where people have used food bank before and have carried on as volunteers, and they distribute that food to people who are just about managing.
Okay, well, it's time, I think, for another break. You're listening to The Mannin Line, and with me in the studio is Neal Mellon from the Isle of Man Food Bank and Geraldine Martin from the Probation Service. And we've been talking about the work of the food bank and some of its peripheral activities as well. And one of those, I think, Neal, we were just talking about while the adverts were on, was, and I hadn't really realised this because I thought the schools provided this already, but you feel there's a need for some form of breakfast club for young people.
Well, we're looking at the use of school breakfast clubs and how they're managed and what the need is. As part of that, we're doing some information capture and working very closely with Williston Primary School. What we do know is schools do have breakfast clubs, but there's still some children that can fall through the net. So that's the area that we want to look at.
Why is that?
Well, for the more affluent parent, this food breakfast clubs can be very useful. They can drop their children off early, get into work, catch a parking space, get on a computer before others. It's handy and convenient. The children are warm, dry and supervised. But for the children who don't have food in the home in the first place, they don't then have the money to pay for the breakfast club when they go into school. And so for the one to £1.50, you miss out on breakfast. We know that a hungry child can become a failure to thrive academically. Long term, that becomes problems then in society. These failure to thrive academically throughout life may mean that you end up being unemployed, become part of the long-term unemployment figures, and potentially you end up perhaps developing a criminal record, end up in prison or on probation services. So what we're trying to do is close the circle in some of these areas.
Okay. You're nodding there, Geraldine.
Well, it's as I said before, really, it's about that early deprivation in so many different ways that can result in people making the wrong choices later on if they feel that they're not supported. Very often the people that Neal's talking about there, the young people, will leave either looked after accommodation at 16, they're on their own, or possibly even 18. Sometimes it's about parents having new partners and placing the priorities with them rather than the children, and all of those choices affect young people who then go on to make worse choices and potentially can be subject to youth justice or adult justice, whether that's the prison or whether it's the probation service. But it's, as I said before, when you look at the social inquiry reports that my staff write, it's rare that you would think, now, how has this happened? If you look at the history of an offender, you can generally see where the pattern started and where things started to deteriorate.
Right, thank you. Now, Rob called. He said in the last century, a lot of the churches had local food funds and coal funds to help people. The churches may have declined, but it's good to see charity for those in need still exists. So, a nice comment. Now, it seems a shame if quite a few people on low incomes have no access to cooking facilities. I think I heard someone say that the Isle of Man regulations say that rooms in multi-occupants buildings, that's guest houses, etc., can't have cooking facilities. Maybe that's because of the potential fire hazard. That's Alice asking that. Right, yes, that's one of the reasons.
That's one of the reasons. Quite a number of years ago, toasters, for example, came out of rooms that people occupied, and that made sense. But then over time, landlords started removing the microwaves. There's been a recent act brought in to deal with houses of multiple occupancy, and that has very clear details on what can and can't be stored in houses.
Okay. And a gentleman called to say that there's a chunky basset hound type dog running about at the top of Richmond Hill. There we are. So we get everything on the programme. And they're trying, some people trying to gather it up, but if it's your dog, that's where it is. Right, so that's a basset hound type dog at the top of Richmond Hill. Now, would a good production kitchen be of benefit to processed food, donations into real meals, or is that outside the remit, says Simon?
It's a very good idea. It's something that we've often thought about. The issues are around things like where we could get one, what we could do, and how we would staff that. But I have been in discussions with agencies such as the WI, looking at whether or not there's a role that they could play in supporting the Foodbank, perhaps becoming a rapid response team for times when we get a glut of food in. For example, in the past I've been presented on a Friday evening with perhaps 100 and odd boxes of strawberries and think, what can I do with this before it goes off? So I know the WI is not just about jam making. I apologise if I'm implying that. But a team like that, with a kitchen behind them, could put a lot of food to good use.
But a kitchen behind them might also be very useful for some form of... Because I noticed all of this seems to be delivering it or collecting it from various places and so on. What about a place where people could go... Geraldine, something like, I don't know what you would call it, a community cafe?
Yes, it's something that we're looking to develop when we open the accommodation for offenders in Tremode House. So I'm very keen that those offenders who are required to live at Tremode House actually gain skills, and some of that is about the very basic skills of looking after themselves, but why not extend that to look after other people as well? We've got a lovely big kitchen there, very well equipped, and a very nice dining room. We had an event during Foodbank Awareness where we used the tables that Marks and Spencer donated, and overnight it became a little restaurant where people were able to understand what you can do with Foodbank food and we'd like to extend that to have some kind of community cafe, invite people in to understand the work of the probation service and
But
the
this isn't
Foodbank.
Tremode, is it?
This is at Tremode House,
Yeah.
yes.
Do you think, and forgive me, but do you think that's a little bit far out for quite a lot of the people who might be round the town?
It was a worry when we actually moved out there. We were based in Prospect House originally on Prospect Hill. That's very convenient for the courts, but it's not proved to be a worry in terms of our offenders reporting there. We also have minibuses that we could use as well if there was one particular group that needed assistance in getting in, you know, whether it be a community centre that wanted to go somewhere different for a change, etc. So we could look at that also.
Now, we talked about that, or I did, and you responded, Neal, about the coal fund.
Yes.
Right, well, we have an answer here. The coal fund is on this Tuesday, starting around 1 o'clock in the midday. A great charity, and I'm very thankful to them, says Davy. So there we are. It's still well underway by the sound of it.
Could we just expand on the community cafe?
Yeah. Oh,
idea,
yes, sorry,
Roger?
yes, yeah.
One of our dreams, it's not policy yet, it's not something that we've committed ourselves to, but one of the dreams for the food bank is to see one day a community cafe or a community coffee shop where people can go and, if you like, reconnect with the human race and get an affordable coffee. It costs about 35p to make a cappuccino. They retail around town at £2.50 upwards. But individuals who need help from the food bank cannot spend that money on a coffee and will go without it for a long time. £2.50 is breakfast for a number of children throughout the week. They can't afford to make that choice. So we could do with one. There's growing evidence that the reintroduction would be supported by societies. There were community cafes in the 40s around the British Isles that were supported by employed people as well as those in need.
Well, of course, as we just had somebody said before, the churches used to do a lot of this, provide midday meals, and the Salvation Army, I think, still does.
It still does, and they're one of our key agents. We work closely with them. We also provide food donations to GRAI, which is a charity that provides hot food and shelter to the homeless. And we also work with agents such as St. Christopher's. We'll provide them with children's food and milk, etc. They work with the younger people coming out of care.
So it's quite a complex web of interdependent-related organisations here, which perhaps the average member of the public might not realise.
Yes, I think when we sit and talk to politicians and others about what we do, everyone's surprised at the extent of the network. As a group, we have opened 2 outlets. Last year we opened the Southern Hub down in Port Erin, and in the last 2 weeks we opened up the Northern Hub of the Isle of Man Food Bank up in Ramsey. So those are 2 other places where people can either donate to or receive food packages from.
Now, the receiving food package now is one that's cropped up here. There's 2 or 3 emails come in, and they all ask much the same question. And that is, what's the process of vetting people who get help? There are people who come up time and time again, and you wonder what they're doing with their money. If they're interviewing them, that's great, but how many of those helped have drink and drug problems? So in other words, first of all, what's the process of vetting?
The process of vetting is a formal interview, as I've described before, so we will go through in detail what factors have pushed people over the edge.
Right, okay.
And then there's an action plan to get them back to being independent. If there is substance abuse issues, that's taken into consideration, but again, these people still need help. What we will not do, however, is we won't subsidise somebody's use or misuse of substances. So if somebody says 100% of my income goes on alcohol or drugs, we're not going to send them away hungry at that time. We'll give them a limited parcel, but we will say, before you come back to discuss this further and get further help, you need to start making decisions about what you're going to contribute into your diet. So if you've got benefits coming in, you need to identify what percentage you're going to put into that.
Right. Would a mobile community cafe be feasible to cover relatively inaccessible areas, asks David.
The idea really excites me, and I'd like to consider that further. At the minute, the transfer of most of the food's done in my car. When I bought it with my pension package, I told my children, nobody's eaten in this car, no takeaways, no food, and it's turned into a chuck wagon. The Foodbank really could do with a van, a delivery van, something like a Ford Transit to allow us to pick up and drop off easily.
Okay.
Or even a bus. One of the projects I worked on previously was to transform a bus into a mobile youth club.
What sort of bus?
It was actually a double-decker bus.
Right,
Yes, we had scaffolding and all sorts involved in the project, but it went around part of Lancashire that I was working in at the time, and it was aimed at young people who wouldn't necessarily go to youth clubs, etc. So there's no reason why we couldn't look at something like that. That bus was donated by Blackpool Corporation, and we had to pay £1 for it. And community service offenders actually renovated the bus, and we then set off to attract young people in that way. But there's no reason why we couldn't turn a bus into a mobile cafe.
But buses, from a little experiences, buses need quite a bit of servicing.
They do indeed.
And that doesn't come cheaply usually.
It doesn't come cheap, but that's where we look to our colleagues from the bus department to be able to help us with something like that.
Right, and fuel, they're quite heavy. Some of the double-deckers used to be pretty heavy on fuel.
They did indeed, and that was one of the reasons they were less popular in later days and only cost us £1. But you take what you're given, don't you?
But were they effective from your object of your exercise?
Absolutely, 100% effective. We had different workers on the buses each night, so it could be that there'll be sexual health workers, mental health, etc., etc. And they all operated just as they would from their offices, but actually on the bus.
Right.
And young people felt able to get on there and get the support that they
needed.
needed.
And they weren't embarrassed at being seen to get on it?
No, absolutely not. It was a bit of a fun thing as well, so it wasn't obvious why you were going to be getting on there. There'd be other things going on. It wasn't simply about those issues. It was about everything else that a young person might be interested in.
Right, okay. Time for another break. Welcome back to the last part of today's Man in Line. I'm Roger Watterson. With me in the studio is Geraldine Martin from the Probation Service and Neal Mellon from the Isle of Man Foodbank. And we've been talking about issues generally around both of those topics. There's a text or come in here, an email that is, nothing to do with food banks, says James, but the Isle of Man airport is running out of de-icer, as we were told on Manx Radio by Miss Reynolds, and she said it was Menzies, and they said they'd used up 2 years worth in one day. So she said, what's 2 years worth on an island that has had no snow or ice in over 2 years? Well, of course, yes, it actually wasn't 2 years in one day. It's a supply of 36 days, which normally would last about 2 years. It didn't come out very well, that. But nevertheless, of course, that's not the first time that's happened. I remember sitting on a plane one Christmas and having to get off because they'd run out of de-icer. So it does happen, I suppose, from time to time. You'd think that's a product you'd be able to get quickly, wouldn't you? Now, what else have we got here quickly? Is it necessarily a criticism of government that food banks are needed in today's community, which is roughly the question I asked earlier on? The excellent service given by the Isle of Man Food Bank, which gives so much encouragement to achieving or renewing self-reliance, sounds like it might be seen more as a partnership with government. And that's Keith asks that question.
Yes, well, we are working with one of the government departments. The Department of Social Security is set up a hungry and homeless group, which is made up of third sector charities and their advisors from the department, and we're meeting on a regular basis to look at how we capture information on these problems.
Mm-hmm. Right, that was that part. Now, apart from your community cafe, and we're looking at one or two other things here, how many, the question they're saying with cafes here, are people, when this is a question about your bus again that's come in, and also the cafes, will nevertheless, even in young people, having said that you wouldn't know what they're going in there for, but a cafe's a cafe. In a community like this, you'd know what it is very, very quickly. Is there not an element of pride that would stop people from asking for help?
pride's one of the biggest inhibitors to people coming forward in the first place to get help with Foodbank and probably with other charities. People don't want to admit that they're struggling. People don't want to have their family know that they're not coping. And so it does hide a lot of things. People that work with us realise very quickly that we're a very confidential service. We don't identify ourselves if we're delivering anything, although we don't specifically have a delivery service as such. So everything's discreet.
Yeah. Well, it's difficult, isn't it, in our society sometimes to do something without somebody else knowing about it. That's the good side of it, and the downside as well. But somebody says here, how many homeless people, which we were touched on 2 or 3 times before, how many homeless people are in the Isle of Man? People without homes living rough. Well, if you go to the UK or Scotland, it's obvious, but not so here. So what are the figures here? What are we talking about?
Well, I think we both have something to say on this, Roger, but effectively you can't measure homelessness completely. What we can do is look at the number of people that access charities such as the Housing Matters Isle of Man and GRI. They will have those figures. The important thing to understand about homelessness on the island is, as you've said, there's not a significant number of rough sleepers, although that will happen. But there are a lot of people who are homeless and who sofa surf, so they're staying in short-term temporary accommodation with friends, relatives. There are people sleeping in garden sheds, people sleeping in cars after breakdowns of relationships, and people staying in inappropriate and unfit accommodation where there's a danger to themselves.
I think certainly for us, one of the things that we see that goes wrong for people is their accommodation. That's a very significant protective factor when it comes to offending behaviour. So one of the key questions when people are leaving prison is, where are you going to be living? And if the offender is going to be subject to a licence condition, so supervised by probation on leaving prison, it's the probation officer's responsibility to check that accommodation is appropriate. And we know that in the cases that go wrong, it tends to be that temporary sofa surfing, as Neal's described, that is risky. If they're going back to a family they have responsibility for, then the likelihood is that they're going to have those protective factors around them. If they're going to be vulnerable to somebody who's sleeping on a sofa, who's in the way very quickly, who potentially don't have really the space for them, there can be fallouts before you know where it is, and people are out on the street again, and then desperate behaviour tends to be
sometimes people have been in prison or whatever. Coming out, of course, can be a financial burden as well, can't they? I mean, for affording the rents, they're not cheap, private rents.
They're not cheap, and we do try to assist with helping people find accommodation, not actually with providing the finance for that. We will support offenders coming out with speaking to the benefits agencies, etc., in advance, so everything that can be put in place is put in place.
Yeah. If somebody's, sorry Roger, if somebody is starting new accommodation, they're going to require a month's rent, a month's deposit, which would be the same amount, and then if they don't already have an account with gas, £250 deposit on the gas line. Quite
expensive starter. Now we literally got 45 seconds and 2 questions have come in. One, and can I ask you very, very quickly, he says he's got, this is all about food, but he has difficulty in finding a home to donate warm clothing. Where can you do it? He said, I've tried all the usual charities. Where's the best place to donate things like jumpers and anoraks?
I think GRI would welcome them, particularly men's clothing. One of the biggest problems for all charities.
Can you have the name again?
GRI on Broadway.
Right, okay.
Manx for Love. But one of the biggest problems for all charities on the island is lack of storage space, and that's where government could help all of us by letting us all share one warehouse.
Okay. Right, there we are. Then that's the end of today's Mannin Line. Catherine Nichols on the switch, and I'm Roger Watterson, and I've been in the excellent company of Neal Mellon, who's from the Isle of Man Foodbank, and Geraldine Martin from the Probation Office.